This is the video lecture for the toxicology lesson plan. It was created by Ivan Caballero and narrated by Sean Krupa. This video and accompanying lesson plan are part of Ohio University's Boat of Knowledge in the Science Classroom, funded by the National Science Foundation. Let's start by trying to answer a few questions. What is your definition of toxicity? Also, name a few substances or items that you consider to be toxic. Take a few minutes to come up with your answers now. Pause this video. In this video, we'll cover the definition of toxicology and toxicity, as well as substances that are toxic to humans. Were any of the substances shown below on your list? Toxicology refers to the study of adverse effects of chemicals and their ability to harm organisms. In order to determine whether or not a substance is toxic, the substances are administered to laboratory animals coupled with documented human exposure cases. One complication are that toxic effects can vary significantly from species to species. Some common laboratory animals used for testing are rats, rabbits, guinea pigs, and hamsters. Now let's cover the primary routes of exposure for toxins. The first primary route of exposure is oral exposure. Oral exposure is any exposure to a toxin which occurs when the chemical is taken in through the mouth and passes through the gastrointestinal tract. The second primary route of exposure is dermal or skin contact exposure. This is the most common route of human exposure. However, with proper hygiene, this type of exposure is generally not serious unless there is a specific, rapid effect of concern. The final primary route of exposure is inhalation exposure. This occurs when a pesticide or other toxin is breathed into the lungs through the nose or mouth. It's important to note that there's not much toxicological concern until the toxin crosses from the lung and into the body. Now let's talk about dose-response relationship. This describes the change in effect on an organism caused by differing levels of doses to a chemical for a certain amount of time. Studying dose-response curves is critical in determining safe and hazardous dosages for drugs, pollutants, and other substances. Dose-response relationships depend on the exposure time and route of the substance. On the right, we see a dose-response curve. The first point on the graph is where a response is greater than 0. This means that a lab animal has died as a result of exposure. This is known as the threshold dose. The LD50 dose is also known as the median lethal dose. This is the dose in which 50% of lab animals exposed to the toxin die as a result. A drug's potency is therefore determined by this LD50 dosage. The more potent a substance is, the steeper the curve will be. Let's talk more about the median lethal dose. As we mentioned, this is the amount or dose of a chemical which produces death in 50% of a population of test animals to which it is administered. The median lethal dose is commonly expressed in the units of milligrams per kilograms. Note, this is milligrams of substance per kilogram of animal body weight. Now let's talk about median lethal concentration. This is the concentration of a chemical in an environment, generally air or water, which produces the median lethal dose. The median lethal concentration is typically expressed as milligrams per liter when it's airborne, or as parts per million when it's in water. Now let's talk about duration of exposure. There are three terms that are commonly used to describe the duration of doses: acute, chronic, and subchronic. Let's examine those more closely. First, let's look at acute exposure. Acute exposure is exactly like it sounds. It's the application of a single or short-term dosing of a chemical. If toxic symptoms are expressed, they are referred to as symptoms of acute toxicity. Moving on, we have chronic exposure. Chronic exposure is the expression of toxic symptoms only after repeated exposure to a chemical in doses regularly applied to the organism for a time greater than half of its life expectancy. If the toxic symptoms are expressed in this case, they are referred to as symptoms of chronic toxicity. Finally, let's talk about subchronic exposure. This is toxic symptoms that are expressed after repeated applications for a time frame less than half of the life expectancy of an organism. The distinction is that it requires more than a single dose or multiple doses applied in a short time. If toxic symptoms are expressed in this case, they are referred to as symptoms of subchronic toxicity. Here are some points to remember about toxins. Less is more when dealing with toxicity. By that we mean the less you need to cause a toxic effect, the more toxic the substance is. Therefore, if two toxins, for example, if one toxin has a median lethal dose of 25 milligrams per kilogram, it's more toxic than another toxin which has a median lethal dose of 7,000 milligrams per kilogram. Now let's talk about signal words. The relative acute toxicity of a substance is reflected on the label in the form of a signal word. The appropriate signal word must appear on every pesticide label. There are three possible signal words: caution, warning, and danger. Let's examine those more closely. Caution reflects the lowest degree of relative toxicity. All toxins or pesticides with a median lethal dose of greater than 50 milligrams per kilogram must display this word on their label. Typically, the caution signal word includes two groups of pesticides classified by the EPA. First are relatively non-toxic, which has a median lethal dose greater than 5,000 milligrams per kilogram, and slightly toxic, which is a median lethal dose between 500 and 5,000 milligrams per kilogram. Next is warning. Warning reflects an intermediate degree of relative toxicity. All toxins or pesticides with a median lethal dose of greater than 50 and less than 500 milligrams per kilogram must display the word warning on their label. Pesticides in this category are classed as moderately toxic. Finally, we have danger. Danger reflects the highest degree of relative toxicity. All pesticides with a median lethal dose of less than 50 milligrams per kilogram must have the word danger displayed on them. Toxins or pesticides here are classified as highly toxic. Now let's talk about the word poison. You may think that poison could apply to anything toxic. However, the word poison has a strict legal definition. Any pesticide with a median effective dose of 50 milligrams per kilogram or less classify as poison. Therefore, labels must have the signal word danger plus the word poison on them. Also, the label must display the international symbol for poison, which is the skull with crossbones. Let's talk for a minute about relative toxicity. Organisms can't differentiate between natural and synthetic chemicals. Just because it's synthetic does not mean it's toxic or poisonous. On the other side, just because something is natural does not mean it's safe or even low risk. Chemicals must be evaluated in their biological context of behavior in organisms. Always treat toxins with caution and respect. Finally, have a realistic recognition of their relative risk in a world of risks. Here are a list of relative toxicities for insecticides. We see several order magnitudes of difference in the median effective dose. Here are lists of relative toxicities for herbicides and additives. Here are two columns for comparative reference. Highly toxic chemicals are in the 0 to 50 mg per kilogram range. This includes botulinus, dioxin, parathion, and so forth. However, moderately toxic chemicals are in the 50 mg to kilogram range. You might be surprised to see caffeine on the list. Similarly, in the highly toxic chemicals, you might be surprised to see nicotine. Moving higher, we have slightly toxic chemicals in the 500 to 5,000 mg per kilogram range. Surprising again, on the right side we see aspirin, vitamin B, and table salt. This asks the question, are all substances toxic? The answer is yes. All substances are toxic to some quantifiable degree. For example, sugar has a median lethal dose of 30,000 milligrams per kilogram. Ethanol has a median lethal dose of only 13,700 milligrams per kilogram. Even water has a recognized median lethal dose of slightly greater than 80,000 milligrams per kilogram. Here are some final words on toxicity. Pesticides and chemicals are introduced into the environment to perform a function. The source of a chemical is irrelevant when considering its toxicity. Toxins should be treated with care and proper respect. This includes some household items such as cleaners, gasoline, kerosene, bleaches, paints, and all other chemicals. Thanks for your attention.